Have you ever thought about how suddenly the rhythm of everyday life can vanish? When familiar voices, the comfort of home, and a sense of safety disappear behind a single door in one night, never to return? What's left after an evening that ends not in silence, but with the wail of sirens? In the early morning hours of July 6, 2024, on Geneva Road in Darlington, police cars arrived. Blue lights danced on the wet pavement as officers and crime scene technicians gathered at the gate of the Vickers family home. Specialists in protective suits moved in and out of a narrow hallway that smelled of disinfectant and metal. The yard had been cordoned off, and a few passersby paused at the edge of the scene, unsure whether to ask questions. Neighbors watched quietly. The previous evening had been filled with laughter from the house. Now there were only short commands from investigators and the click of a camera photographing the kitchen, the table, the dishes, the scattered items. Nobody knew exactly what had happened. Only one thing was clear. A 14-year-old girl had died in that home. On the front steps sat Sarah Howe. Her shoulders trembled, but there were no tears, only a shell of shock. A paramedic covered her with a blanket as she stared into nothingness, unresponsive. A short way away stood Simon Vickers. His hands were handcuffed, his eyes cast downward. They guided him slowly toward the police car. Nobody spoke. Inside the house, bags of evidence were being carried out. Kitchen utensils, clothing, a cell phone. Every step was documented. Every detail recorded. Everything pointed to the night's end being far from a simple accident. And although no one yet knew exactly what had occurred, one thing was already clear. Laughter would never echo through that house again. At the Vickers family home on Geneva Road, on the evening of July 5th, 2024, the atmosphere had been the usual calm. Simon arrived home from work around 7 p.m., turned on the TV to watch the Euro 2024 match. A bottle of red wine sat on the table in front of him, from which he had drunk most, along with a hand-rolled cigarette containing hashish. He seemed relaxed, yet noticeably dulled. In the kitchen, Sarah Howe was preparing dinner. Macaroni boiled in a pot, meat sauce simmered in a pan. She moved quickly, as always, monitoring the process and timing of the meal. The family was used to simple evenings, TV, food, conversations without hurry. Their daughter, 14-year-old Scarlett, was in her room. She was scrolling through TikTok, chatting with friends, but soon tired of the screen and came downstairs. It was about 10:15 p.m. The kitchen smelled of tomatoes and spices. The girl approached her mother, complained of being bored, and began helping, tasting the sauce, joking. Sarah responded in kind, tossing a few grapes to her daughter, and a short, harmless little game began. Both of them were laughing, not noticing that Simon was growing irritated. The noise and laughter made it hard for him to focus on the game, drowning out the commentators' voices. He called out to them, asking them to stop, but his request went mostly ignored. A few minutes later, still in a playful mood, Sarah walked over to her husband with a pair of kitchen tongs and gently pinched his arm, expecting a smile in return. Instead, Simon let out a sharp yell and jerked his arm away, saying it hurt. Scarlett, watching the scene, smirked and told him not to take everything so seriously. That comment pushed him even further. Under the influence, he lost his temper, turned toward the counter, and without looking, grabbed an object lying nearby. Simon was sure he was picking up the tongs, but in his hand was a kitchen knife with a long, thin blade. The movement was impulsive. He swung his arm toward his daughter, more out of frustration than any intent to cause harm. But the knife slipped from his fingers. The blade entered Scarlett's chest just below her left shoulder. The wound was deep. The knife pierced her lung and grazed her heart. The girl collapsed to the floor immediately. Panicking, Sarah ran over, pressed a towel against the wound, and called out to her husband. He stood frozen, unable to process what had happened. Within seconds, she contacted the emergency service. The crew arrived in just a few minutes. Medics performed life-saving measures, but the injuries were not survivable. At 11:50 p.m., the doctor declared her deceased. The kitchen that had been filled with laughter minutes earlier became the place where their daughter's life ended. Once Scarlett's body was taken away, only the parents and officers from the Durham County Police remained inside. The scene was sealed off, and the kitchen was marked with caution tape. The investigator noted no signs of a struggle. The dishes were in place, furniture undamaged, no evidence of anything being knocked over. Everything looked ordinary, except for the blood on the tile. Sarah was seated on the couch. She didn't cry, didn't move, her eyes unfocused. She answered questions briefly, in single words, as if she couldn't hear them. Her blood pressure was low, her speech disorganized. Paramedics left her under the supervision of a police medic. Simon was taken to the next room. His clothes were stained with blood, his pupils dilated. He insisted it was an accident, that he had tongs, not a knife. When officers checked his breath, they noted a strong smell of alcohol and signs of hashish use. The initial assessment concluded with the collection of the weapon, a kitchen knife with a metal handle. It was found on the floor near the refrigerator. A photographer documented the angle of the blade relative to the body to later compare with medical records. The knife was sealed in a plastic container. The report was filled out step by step. Time of discovery, number of people present, the parents' positions. On the table, an open bottle of wine and an ashtray with the remains of a hand-rolled cigarette were documented as potential evidence of substance influence. The homicide detective arrived just after 1 a.m. After a quick briefing, he began questioning Simon in the presence of a public defender. Simon's answers were confused and inconsistent. He changed the order of events, got the timeline wrong, and alternated between saying the knife slipped and that his daughter got too close. These contradictions were immediately noted in the report. Sarah gave her statement separately. Her version aligned only partially. She said Simon swung his arm, without looking, and that everything happened in an instant. Following the interviews, the house was officially sealed. The parents were taken to the station for further questioning. That marked a turning point, from a family tragedy to a criminal investigation. The home where dinner had just been cooking was now a crime scene. Every drop on the floor became potential evidence that this might not have been an accident after all. On the morning of July 6, 2024, Simon Vickers was formally interviewed at the police station. Before the interrogation, a medical assessment confirmed signs of alcohol use. The smell on his breath, unsteady gait, and a blood alcohol level above the legal limit. Traces of cannabinoids were also found. The medical report deemed Simon fit to speak, but with cognitive limitations due to his condition. 2 detectives and a stenographer were present in the interview room. At first, Simon refused to talk, but when asked to explain what happened, he finally said, "It was a joke. I didn't mean it." His explanation was contradictory and confusing. Initially, he claimed he meant to throw kitchen tongs on the floor to break up an argument between his wife and daughter, but grabbed the wrong thing. Later, he said he didn't throw anything, that the knife just slipped. The lead detective repeatedly asked him to clarify the sequence. Simon got the timeline wrong, saying at first he was sitting at the table, then that he was standing near the TV. When asked where his daughter was, his answers shifted from by the door to near the stove to walking past. When shown photos of the knife, he stared at the image for a long time and finally said, "I thought it was the tongs." His words were recorded verbatim. Within the first 20 minutes, it became clear his story conflicted with forensic evidence. A medical expert consulted by phone confirmed the wound had been inflicted at an angle that made an accident unlikely. That assessment was added to the preliminary report, casting serious doubt on the claim of a mishap. After a short break, Simon repeated that he never meant to cause harm, describing the event as a game that got out of hand. He admitted he doesn't remember everything, blaming it on intoxication. When asked how much he drank, he said it was about a bottle of wine or a little less, and mentioned using some banned substances to relax. The detectives kept a steady tone, noting every inconsistency. Simon insisted he loved his daughter, that they never argued. When asked about the moment of the injury, he said, "I swung my arm without looking." Then she fell. It was over in a second. That sentence was officially documented as an admission of action. By 4 a.m., the lead investigator informed Simon that his status was being changed from witness to the incident to suspect in the death of a child. Simon responded with disbelief, repeating that he wasn't a killer. His court-appointed attorney insisted the interview be paused until the morning. In another office at that same time, a formal report was being drafted to reclassify the case. The document read, "The death of 14-year-old Scarlett Vickers is now considered suspicious. Evidence points to possible involvement of her father. A criminal case has been opened under charges of homicide or involuntary manslaughter, pending forensic review." Simon was placed in a holding cell. Surveillance footage showed he wasn't aggressive. He just sat with his head down, occasionally whispering she was just joking. Around 9 the next morning, investigators received the results of the toxicology report. It showed a blood alcohol level of 0.14% and traces of THC, the main psychoactive compound found in cannabis. These findings became the basis for modifying the charges to an act committed while under the influence, resulting in the death of a minor. That same day, a formal order was issued to keep Simon Vickers in custody until the investigation was complete. His rights were explained to him, and he was informed that the case would now be handled by the Major Crimes Unit. By this point, the Vickers family's story was no longer a private tragedy. It had become a criminal case where a father, who had believed he was the victim of a terrible accident, was now officially accused of causing the death of his own daughter. Simon Vickers and Sarah Howe lived in Darlington, in a small home on Geneva Road. He worked at a factory, and she picked up shifts at a local store. They married young and spent years dreaming of a child, enduring loss during pregnancy. Their dream finally came true in 2010, when Scarlett was born. The family lived modestly, without conflict or drama. Neighbors remembered them as calm, peaceful people who always spent time together. Simon worked hard, and Sarah managed the home. Their daughter was the center of their world. Scarlett grew up friendly and full of life. Teachers noted how easily she connected with others, her passion for social media, and the videos she made for TikTok. At home, she helped her mom and occasionally argued with her dad, as most teens do, but she was always the first to make peace. There were no reports of violence or serious disputes in the family. Police checked their records and found not a single call to their address. Friends confirmed everything always seemed normal. No one imagined anything bad could happen in that household. That's why the night of July 5th, 2024, shocked all of Darlington. No one could believe that in a home known for peace and order, a tragedy took place that could never be undone. A few days after Simon Vickers' arrest, investigators began digging into his past. What they found took even some family members by surprise. Back in 1993, Simon had been convicted in a criminal case involving an assault with a Stanley knife. At the time, Simon was 19. He got into a fight outside a bar in Darlington and during the altercation slashed another man's arm. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but the court found him guilty of assault with a weapon. Simon admitted guilt and served a 2-year prison sentence. After his release, he stayed out of legal trouble, held down a steady job, and was, according to co-workers, a model employee. This newly uncovered history had a significant impact on how investigators assessed Simon's behavior. What had initially appeared to be a one-time tragic event was now being viewed through the lens of a prior incident involving a bladed weapon. Prosecutors requested a psychological evaluation to determine whether Simon had a pattern of impulsive behavior. The psychologist who had worked with Simon during his time in prison described him as generally self-controlled and stable, but prone to sudden outbursts of anger under stress or when under the influence of alcohol. In the 1990s, this observation didn't carry much weight. But 30 years later, it took on new relevance. Investigators compared the past and present. In both cases, there was a knife. In both, emotional tension was involved. The difference was in the outcome. In 1993, the victim survived. In 2024, a child had died. Experts highlighted behavioral similarities: impulsive action, no premeditation, followed by immediate remorse. This discovery led to debate within the investigative team. Some believed the decades-old offense shouldn't influence the current case. Others argued it revealed a recurring behavioral pattern, violent reactions triggered by alcohol. Ultimately, the decision was made to include Simon's prior conviction in the court materials. The psychological profile developed from interviews and expert sessions described Simon as someone who internalized his emotions, appearing calm on the outside, but often harboring silent frustration. He rarely voiced his complaints, avoided open conflict, but built up irritation over time. When intoxicated, he was prone to losing control and reacting disproportionately to the situation at hand. Investigators reached a preliminary conclusion. The tragedy of July 5th may not have been a random accident, but rather the result of a combination of factors: alcohol, the influence of banned substances, and repressed aggression that had surfaced before. This information marked a turning point in the investigation. From the moment Simon's past conviction was uncovered, his defense strategy began to unravel. What was once viewed as a tragic accident was now taking shape as a criminal case involving a repeated pattern of violent behavior. After Simon Vickers was taken into custody, the investigation moved into the forensic phase. The top priority was to determine exactly how and with what the fatal wound had been inflicted. The knife recovered at the scene was sent to the Durham Forensic Crime Lab for analysis. Experts conducted a detailed examination of the knife. They found that the blade was 7.6 inches long and 0.87 inches wide. Simon Vickers' fingerprints were clearly present on the handle, and traces of blood found on the blade matched Scarlett's DNA. No other fingerprints or biological evidence were detected. The analysis also confirmed there were no signs of impact damage or scraping on the blade, ruling out the possibility of a random deflection or accidental ricochet. Particular attention was paid to the angle and direction of the wound. According to the experts, the knife entered the body at approximately a 40-degree angle, with significant force. The wound was about 4.3 inches deep. It damaged the left lung and the heart, leading to immediate massive internal bleeding. Forensics experts emphasized that this type of trajectory was nearly impossible from an accidental toss. The motion was deliberate and made from close range. A 3D model of the kitchen was created to reconstruct the scene. Taking into account the furniture layout, the trajectory of the stab, and the relative height of the individuals, investigators concluded Simon had been no more than 5 feet away from his daughter. This ruled out the possibility of the knife simply slipping from his hand during movement or an accidental release. Meanwhile, Simon's blood test results confirmed the presence of alcohol and cannabinoids, but not at levels high enough to suggest complete loss of motor control. Experts concluded that while his decision-making may have been impaired, his physical coordination remained intact, indicating the arm movement was conscious, even if impulsive. The autopsy on Scarlett Vickers confirmed the forensic findings. The wound had been inflicted from the front at a downward angle and was a stab-slash combination. The injury to the heart caused immediate circulatory failure. There were no defensive wounds on her arms, face, or body, suggesting the strike was sudden and occurred in a moment of perceived safety and trust. The final report, signed by Durham's chief medical examiner, contained a critical conclusion. The nature and force of the injury are inconsistent with any accidental drop or slippage of the knife. The strike was purposeful, with controlled directional movement of the hand. Upon receiving this report, the case was reclassified. Durham Police's investigative unit changed the classification from suspicious death to intentional homicide without premeditation. The district attorney approved the revised charge and authorized the case to be transferred to the Major Crimes Division. The forensic report became the turning point. Up until its release, there was still a chance the incident could have been ruled an accident. But after a thorough analysis of the evidence, investigators were left with no doubt. The death of Scarlett Vickers was the result of an intentional act by her father. In the aftermath, Sarah Howe remained the only witness and the primary source of information for the investigation. The first rounds of questioning were held in the hospital under the supervision of a psychologist. She was in a state of shock, spoke in short phrases, and repeatedly insisted that what happened had been a tragic mistake. Even after learning about her daughter's passing and her husband's arrest, Sarah continued to defend Simon. She maintained that he loved their child, was never aggressive, and had never even raised his voice. According to her, he simply made a fatal mistake that night, confusing the object in his hand. Investigators noted that Sarah refused to consider the possibility of intent and declined to read the official reports. Psychologists viewed this as a form of denial, a coping mechanism to preserve the illusion of normal life. With time, Sarah came to accept that there was no going back. The loss of her daughter and the legal downfall of her husband shattered the world she had known. After the trial, she left Darlington and cut off contact with former neighbors. To her, both deaths, the physical death of her child and the emotional collapse of her relationship, became one and the same, taking from her everything that mattered. Darlington is a small town, where news travels faster than the official statements. By the morning after the incident, local headlines read, "Man arrested after daughter's death on Geneva Road." The name Vickers wasn't released until days later, but by then, the family's life had already been publicly dissected. In pubs, at bus stops, in corner shops, people weren't just talking about the child's death. They were bringing up Simon's past, speculating about hidden family tensions no one knew about. Opinions varied, but most people agreed this wasn't just a freak accident. Newspapers ran photos of the house. Neighbors were interviewed, often repeating the same line. The family always seemed so normal. On social media, Sarah was harshly criticized for standing by her husband, accused of silent complicity. Some residents openly said she should leave Darlington, just so the town wouldn't be reminded of what happened. Sarah became completely isolated. The shop where she worked terminated her contract. On the street, people avoided her, crossing to the other side. She was labeled the mother whose husband is accused of killing their child. Even months after Simon's arrest, the town was still talking. Some called it an accident, but most believed he was guilty of something irreversible. For Darlington, the Vickers tragedy became more than just a headline. It was a line that divided the town's collective conscience, proof of how one event can not only destroy a household, but also erode the trust the community once placed in someone they thought they knew. The trial of Simon Vickers began in January 2025 at the Teesside Crown Court. The charge was formalized as intentional homicide without premeditation. The hearings drew significant media attention. In his opening statement, the prosecutor laid out in detail the events of July 5th, 2024. He emphasized that Scarlett's death could not have been an accident. That claim was backed by forensic analysis of Simon's actions, the presence of alcohol and traces of banned substances in his system, and Simon Vickers' prior criminal record. The defense offered a very different version. Simon's attorney insisted it was a tragic mistake, one made in a moment of intoxication and emotional confusion, without any intent to cause harm. He argued that Simon had always been a caring father, with no history of conflict with his daughter. The defense asked the court to consider his full cooperation, his emotional remorse, and the absence of any signs of premeditated violence. Expert witnesses took the stand. The medical examiner stated that the nature of Scarlett's wounds ruled out the possibility of an accidental throw. His testimony became a key piece of the prosecution's case. Sarah Howe's testimony added tension to the courtroom. She recounted the evening leading up to the tragedy, described the household atmosphere, and explained her actions. When asked directly by the prosecution whether her husband intended to hurt their daughter, she said she didn't believe it, but couldn't explain how the knife had ended up directed at Scarlett. Her words contradicted expert findings, sparking debate between both sides. The judge had to pause her testimony multiple times due to her emotional state. When it was Simon's turn, the courtroom was packed. He spoke softly, with frequent pauses. He admitted to being drunk and having used hashish that night, but denied ever intending harm. He said the movement was impulsive, that he wasn't even aware the object in his hand was a knife. "I loved my daughter more than life," he said. "If I could take back that second, I would give anything." During cross-examination, he struggled to explain why he grabbed the knife or how it struck at such an angle. His tears, shaking voice, and overall demeanor moved some jurors, but the facts presented in court remained unchanged. By the close of the proceedings, both sides had solidified their arguments. The judge informed the court that a decision would be made following jury deliberation. The nearly 2-week-long trial had become more than a legal battle. It had become a public reckoning, the culmination of a story that started as a private tragedy and became a symbol of loss and accountability. The final phase of the trial began on January 24, 2025. The prosecutor reminded jurors that the fatal stab had been delivered at close range and that Simon Vickers knew he was holding a knife. He highlighted Vickers's previous conviction involving a knife. The defense insisted it was a tragic error brought on by intoxication and confusion. The attorney reminded jurors that Vickers had immediately called emergency services and never tried to flee. He pleaded for the court to recognize the absence of intent. The forensic report confirmed that the wound was deep and precise, but it couldn't conclusively determine if Simon had acted with full awareness. A psychologist testified that Simon exhibited strong feelings of guilt and signs of emotional trauma. The courtroom was silent. Sarah sat still. The jury looked tense. In his final words, Simon said softly, "I loved her. I never wanted this to happen." Then the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate, to decide whether this was an accident or a crime. On January 31, 2025, the Teesside Crown Court found Simon Vickers guilty of murdering his daughter. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 15 years. The judge called Scarlett's death the result of a reckless and destructive act by a man who had lost control. Sarah wept silently in court, never lifting her head. The judge offered his condolences, making it clear that all responsibility lay with the defendant. Media headlines called the verdict a gesture of justice for a girl everyone loved. After the trial, Sarah left Darlington and moved in with her sister. She avoided the press, kept to herself, and held on to only a few of Scarlett's belongings. Vickers was transferred to Leeds Prison, where he remains under psychological observation in solitary confinement. The house on Geneva Road stood empty for a long time. The windows were shuttered, and faded flowers and stuffed animals still hung from the gate, where there was once the laughter of a child. Now there is only silence, the only reminder of what this family lost.